Why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon if you're joining us from a different time zone. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and together with my colleague, Professor Arnold Franklin, the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Queens College, we want to welcome you all to today's jointly sponsored program, which features a talk by Dr. Idelson-Shein. So as you can see, we're still running many of our events on Zoom this semester. Of course, there's nothing quite like being in the same room together, but Zoom is allowing us to program lectures by speakers, such as Dr. Idelson-Shein, who is in Israel, and to reach our audience in the most diverse places. So it's really lovely to see some old friends on this call and also many new faces. If you're new to the programs of our two centers and would like to learn more about the activities of the Centers for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center and at Queens College, we'd love to hear from you. So please email us. We can put you on our mailing lists and keep you informed about our upcoming programs. And we'll make sure to put all contacts in the chat box in just a moment. This event, as you can see, is being recorded. It will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. So I want to invite you to please keep your microphones muted during Dr. Idelson-Shein's talk. After the talk, we will have plenty of time for questions. And please feel free to use whatever method works for you. You can type the word question in the chat box. You can use the hand raise function. We'll make sure to call on you in the order that we receive. If you're unable to unmute yourself, please type your question in the chat and we'll make sure to read it out loud for you. So now it's time to introduce our fantastic speaker for today. Idelson-Shein teaches in the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev. She is the Norbert, Blechner, and Friends Career Development Chair in East European Jewish Culture and an elected member of the Israel Young Academy. Idelson-Shein is the principal investigator of the collaborative research project on Jewish translation and cultural transfer in early modern Europe, funded by the European Research Council, the ERC. Her research interests include cultural translation, old Yiddish literature, science, and notions of race, gender, and sexuality in early modern Europe. Her book, Difference of a Different Kind, Jewish Constructions of Race During the Long 18th Century, which I wholeheartedly recommend, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2014. She is also the co-editor with Christian Wiese of Monsters and Monstrosity in Jewish History from the Middle Ages to Modernity, which came out for Bloomsbury in 2019. And her work has appeared in journals such as the American Historical Review, 18th-Century Studies, and the Jewish Quarterly Review. Iris, we're really delighted to have you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And it's really great to be able to discuss my work with you today. And I want to thank Francesca and Arnold for the opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen. So please, oh, hang on, something is kind of stuck. Okay. Okay. Is that okay? Can you see the presentation? Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the phenomenon of translations of non-Jewish, primarily European texts into Jewish languages during the early modern period. That's roughly between 1500 and 1800. I'm going to try and answer just give kind of preliminary answers to some of the basic questions, or three basic questions surrounding this phenomenon. That is, first of all, who are these people who translate the works from non-Jewish languages into Jewish languages during this period? Why do they decide to translate these works, and how do they actually go about doing it? How do they translate from European languages to Jewish ones? But before I begin to do all that, what I'd like to do is to kind of try and think about what this means and what's at stake when we say that such a project even existed? Why is it important for us to know this, even if we're not specifically interested in early modern Jewish history or in translation studies? I think this bears relevance, deep contemporary relevance, even political relevance for us today. And is important to anyone who's interested in the relationship between science and faith, religion and reason, and generally how cultures come into contact, what kind of dialogue is possible between primarily minority cultures and hegemonic cultures or majority cultures, and so on. So I'm going to start with a more immediate kind of history. What you're seeing here is a poster from an ad campaign that came out a few years ago by the Israeli ultra-Orthodox party, Yahadut Torah. In Israel, we call this a Gewalt campaign. This was a campaign that was made to intimidate potential voters, kind of impressing on them what would happen if they failed to vote for the party in the upcoming elections. And there was a series of posters, but the most famous poster was this one. And you can see the word here in bright blue letters is Euclides, which is Euclid in English. It's underlined by this kind of blood red smear. And the accompanying text reads, no, this is not the name of a drug. This is a Greek mathematician about which your child will learn, rather than learning rabbinical or studying rabbinical literature. Of course, should the party not be part of the upcoming government. Now, of course, this campaign caused quite some outrage in Israel, and it's understandable, but there was actually something that most viewers of this poster seemed to have missed, and that was the fact that in mentioning Euclid specifically, and in invoking the fact that he is a Greek mathematician, Yahadut Torah, or at least the authors of this poster, were actually participating in an age-old debate about the legitimacy of the pursuit of extra-Jewish wisdom, or as it has been known for centuries, Greek wisdom. So the term Greek wisdom actually originates in antiquity, and already in the Talmud, we read, "Cursed be a man who rears pigs, and cursed be a man who teaches his son Greek wisdom." Now you can see here that there is this kind of analogy between rearing pigs and studying what we today would call secular studies. And that is meant to signify the fact that just like a good Jew has nothing to do with a pig, a good Jew also has nothing to do with non-Jewish knowledge. It's absolutely useless, and it could actually be contaminating for anyone who calls himself a good kosher Jew. But already in the very same Talmudic discussion, we encounter a very different approach. A different voice is kind of discernible when Rabban Gamliel, who is the Nasi, the head or the high priest of the Sanhedrin, tells us that there were 1,000 students in my father's house, 500 studied the Torah, and 500 studied Greek wisdom. So you can see here a very different approach, according to which, you know, the ideal Torah scholar has both Jewish knowledge, religious knowledge, and extra Jewish knowledge, Greek wisdom. The two are kind of compatible, they can coexist. So if you had to characterize the Talmud's approach towards the question of the pursuit of non-Jewish literature, one could at best characterize it as ambiguous or ambivalent. And it doesn't get much clearer in later generations. During the medieval period, and the early modern period, there were those who claimed that the pursuit of non-Jewish studies is a waste of time, or that it is a diversion from the straight path of Torah studies, and even that it is liable to contaminate the minds of young, impressionable Jews. There were those who claimed that no Jew should learn anything but the Talmud alone. On the other hand, there were those who viewed religious and secular studies as being complementary and claimed that they can coexist and that in fact they strengthen one another. The immediate name that comes to mind, of course, is Maimonides, but one could also mention Ashkenazi thinkers such as Moses Isserles, and I would argue the Vilna Gaon, but I'll say a few words about that in a few minutes. There was also one approach that claimed that there really is no such thing as Greek wisdom, and that all knowledge is in fact inherently Jewish. And I'm referring here to a myth known as the Jewish origins of science and philosophy, which also originates in antiquity and became extremely popular in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. And as an example, one could mention that there was a rumor that was pretty widespread, it appears in a number of works, according to which Greek philosophy originates from a chance encounter between Plato, the great Greek philosopher, and the prophet Jeremiah, which took place in Egypt. So it was really into this ancient debate that Yahadut HaTorah's ad campaign aimed to contribute by mentioning Euclid. The party was telling its voters that yes, there is such a thing as Greek wisdom and that it is an illegitimate pursuit for good kosher Jews. It is detrimental to religious observance. But for all its sophistication, its sly references to Talmudic debates and Greek mathematicians, there was something a bit off about this poster. And I think anyone who's worked closely with 18th century scientific works in Hebrew would find the invocation of Euclid, of all people, somewhat ironic. And I'll explain why. So Yahadut HaTorah is in large part made up of Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, whose father figure is, to some extent, the Vilna Gaon. And of course, the Vilna Gaon is Elijah Vilna is one of the towering figures of Ashkenazi religious thought. He is an influential rabbinical thinker and a very well-known opponent of Hasidism, an influential ruler on halachic matters, but he was also, it appears, quite the Euclid fan. And we know this because in 1780, there appeared this book by another East European Jewish rabbi, whose name is Baruch Shik of Shklov. And this is a translation of Euclid's Elements. It's called Sefer Euclidus. And it opens with a preface in which Baruch Shik tells us that the incentive for writing the book or for translating Euclid was a meeting that he had with the Gaon in the winter of 1778 in Vilnius. And during that meeting, Baruch Shik tells us, Elijah of Vilna urged him to translate into our holy tongue whatever is possible from the sciences so that wisdom will spread throughout the people of Israel. And he also said, according to Shik's testimony, to the degree that a man is lacking in other sciences, he will lack 100-fold in the wisdom of the Torah, for the Torah and the sciences are bound together. Now, I should mention that this anecdote, which appears in Shik's translation of Euclid, is highly contested. It's been debated for centuries. There are those who claim that it never happened, particularly those who, like Yahadut HaTorah, do not think that religion and Greek wisdom are compatible. And on the other hand, there are those who use this anecdote to show that Judaism has always been open to non-Jewish wisdom and that the two go hand in hand. Now, one of the aims of my project is not so much to demonstrate the compatibility of religion and science, but I do want to show that Jewish thinkers' kind of relationship with non-Jewish literature was much more complicated and much more nuanced than we today tend to imagine. So on the one hand, thinkers like Elijah of Vilna were open to non-Jewish knowledge. They were interested in it, and they did want to import elements from it into the Jewish literary sphere. But at the same time, they were not uncritical in their reception of non-Jewish thought, and they were apprehensive of the implications of the pursuit of extra-Jewish knowledge or of secular studies. And I think one of the ways in which, or I would actually argue that the primary way in which these thinkers dealt with this ambivalence towards extra-Jewish knowledge, that as we've seen goes all the way back to the Talmud, was through the medium of translation. By translating works from the non-Jewish literary sphere into Jewish languages, they were able, on the one hand, to participate in the culture of the surrounding environment, the majority cultures. But on the other hand, they were able to bring back into Judaism specific texts and prevent others from entering Jewish culture, and to harness all of these texts to meet a specifically Jewish worldview and agenda, and to fit the unique needs of a Jewish target readership. So, who were the translators? During the early modern period, there really emerged a very versatile corpus of translations. And when I talk about Jewish translations, I'm particularly talking about translations into Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, and Judeo-Italian. And the translators themselves are a deeply heterogeneous group. Within the construction of this corpus, we'll find rabbis like Baruch Shikov Shklov, or possibly also the Vilna Gaon himself, and certainly his son, but also other more people who are more the immediate suspects of intercultural transfer and intercultural dialogue. So I'll just give a few kind of examples of who I understand to be the primary agents of Jewish translation in this period. So first of all, we have physicians. And this is not surprising. Physicians are in a particularly privileged position to import texts from Latin and the European vernaculars into Judaism, because they are in European universities during this period. They have to know Latin. They have to be able to study works in Latin and to read works in Latin. And also, we should always bear in mind that medicine enjoyed relative legitimacy within Jewish culture from the Middle Ages, at least the Middle Ages, until today, in large part because of its utility for everyday Jews and for every Jew. So these translators were able to kind of relate to the image of the rabbi translators, such as Maimonides, and people who are already in the Middle Ages had no qualms about using non-Jewish literature, both contemporary and earlier. So that's one type of translator that we will find in the early modern period. In the second half of the 18th century, these translators are joined by a new cohort of Jewish translators known as the Maskilim, or thinkers of the Jewish Enlightenment. The most famous maskil, of course, is Moses Mendelssohn, and of course, translation played a huge role in Mendelssohn's intellectual development. But already in 1755, Mendelssohn actually kind of begins his career as a maskil with a translation, a pretty well-known translation by now, of Edward Young's Night Thoughts. The original poem appeared in English, but this is translated via the German. So that's just one example of the kind of work of translation that is often pursued by the Maskilim. And this is actually the corpus of all of these kind of corpora of Jewish translation. This is the one that has been studied the most extensively. Then we have converts. And just like physicians, converts are also in a particularly advantageous position to produce translation, because they come into Judaism with the kind of cultural capital that enables them to introduce new texts and ideas. They have a familiarity with non-Jewish literatures and languages that most Jews simply won't have. On the other hand, converts from Judaism to Christianity are much in the same way also in an advantageous position to produce translation because of their familiarity with Jewish languages and with Jewish literary norms. So what they do is simply translate for missionary purposes. And here you can see one example. This is a translation by a guy called Emanuel Tremelius from 1554. And he translates Calvin's Catechism into Hebrew. And this is the focus of ongoing work. Then we have book printers. So book printers are also very active in the field of translation, either as translators themselves or by commissioning translations from anonymous translators. These translators produce primarily Yiddish translations, and this isn't a coincidence. It stems from the fact that translation into Yiddish is considered financially viable, unlike translation into Hebrew. You can see two examples here of translators who are themselves printers. This is Shabtai Bass, who translates kind of a travel guide into Yiddish in 1680. And this is Joseph Marson, who is actually the son of the translators. This is kind of a family of translators. Both of them are based in Amsterdam, which is a major hub of printing during this period, Jewish printing or Hebrew printing. But most of the translators of Old Yiddish literature are anonymous translators about whom we know very, very little. And then, of course, we have to me, the most exciting kind of translators, who are these rabbinical thinkers who kind of take it upon themselves to produce translations primarily in Hebrew, but sometimes also in Yiddish. Two examples, and I'll say a bit more about them later. This is Rabbi Solomon of Chelm, who's a Polish rabbi. He publishes, or he doesn't actually publish, he prepares this manuscript around 1781 called Chug Haaretz, and it's a translation of two Latin texts primarily. And Abraham ben Elijah of Vilna, who in 1800 publishes a book called Gvulot Aretz, Borders of the Land, which is in fact a translation, for the most part, of this work, the Histoire naturelle by Georges-Louis Leclerc de Buffon, who is a thinker of the French Enlightenment, a rather outrageous thinker at that. And this kind of confirms the rumor that the Gaon did indeed urge his disciples to produce translations, as Sheik tells us, because Abraham ben Elijah of Vilna is, of course, the son of the Vilna Gaon. So what you can see here is that the passion for translation really brought together Jews from widely disparate spaces, classes, and cultures. But the question is why? Why are all these people producing translations during the early modern period? What is it about translation that interests them? Now, I should say that there could be numerous reasons why a particular translator would choose to translate a particular text into a particular language. I've already mentioned the fact that Yiddish translators often employed economic considerations. Converts often view translations as a means of kind of immersing themselves into Jewish culture, presenting themselves as Jews. And there could be any number of other reasons. There are some of which are really not accessible to us today: hidden agendas, personal considerations, and so on and so forth. But I'm not so much interested in these unvoiced kind of agendas and concealed motivations. What interests me primarily is what these translators choose to tell their readers about their motivations. Why? What is it that is considered a legitimate reason to translate in early modern Jewish culture? And I can, so what I've done is I've actually looked at the prefaces of a litany of Hebrew and Yiddish translations in particular, to see what translators tell their readers. And I think we can identify three primary justifications for translations that recur in these prefaces. So the first one is that translation is a means for fortifying Jewish faith. Translators will tell their readers, you know, I'm bringing this text in from non-Jewish literature, but my only purpose here, my only aim is to strengthen Jewish culture, and I'm doing that through translation. Sometimes this will be polemical, other times this will, the assumption will be that science helps us to see the glory and greatness of God, and so on and so forth. Then we have the notion that translation is a means for reclaiming lost Jewish knowledge, and this goes back to this notion of Judaism being the source of all wisdom. So in translating a work from a non-Jewish language into a Jewish one, I'm simply bringing back what the Gentiles have stolen from the Jews. So that's another kind of justification for translation that appears in these texts. And then we have the notion that translation is a form of cultural gatekeeping. And I find this particular motivation to be the most interesting, and I think one of the most Jewish. It's a very Jewish kind of understanding of what it is that translation does. It's kind of indicative. It's a notion that is indicative of a minority culture that is, on the one hand, interested in maintaining its own cultural distinctiveness, but on the other hand, is interested in dialogue with the surrounding culture. And it uses translation in order to kind of keep that balance between cultural isolation and, so to speak, assimilation. So I'm going to focus on this third justification. I'll just give two quick examples from rabbinical literature to show how this works. So my first example is taken from a book called Sefer Birat Migdal Oz, by the very well-known German rabbi Yaakov Emden. This is from around 1747. He publishes a book on ethics, and he explains in the preface that in order to prepare this book, he had to use non-Jewish literature. And he explains this in many ways. He talks about the myth of the origins of the Jewish origins of all non-Jewish knowledge, and he talks about the ambivalence of the Talmud towards Greek wisdom, and so on and so forth. And then he gives us a solution to the problem. So this is what he writes. I have brought unto you all the good parts of the morals of those of the nations known for their wisdom. And God knows and is witness to all the great pains to which I have gone, and all the toils I have undertaken for you, so that nothing of the morals will escape your attention in whatever language it is written, and also to save you, so that you do not approach the doors of their houses and drink their evil waters. And of course, he's talking about the Gentiles here. And so that you are not taken captive in their fortresses. So you can see that Emden here presents what he's doing as a form of altruism, right? I've gone out into the hazardous realm of non-Jewish literature so that you don't have to. And this is, I think, is a really remarkable way of thinking about translation. And what is also remarkable is the fact that we'll find the same sentiment in many, many other texts from this period. So just one more example, and this is a particularly poignant one, I think. This is from an approbation by Shaul Halevi of Hagas, another rabbi from the 18th century, and it appears in Baruch Shik of Shklov's Sefer Euclidus, so that same translation of Euclid that was prompted by a conversation with the Gaon. And this is what Shaul Halevi writes. Since we have been exiled, wisdom has been lost and foreigners have taken it over. But if an Israelite should navigate among the nations to learn sciences from foreign books, waves of foreign knowledge will divert him from the straight path. And now the great and excellent Rabbi Baruch Shik of Shklov has arisen to print the book of Euclid in the holy tongue, to restore the crown to its original splendor. So again, the notion that knowledge originates in Judaism, and wisdom to its proper dwelling, so that Israel shall not need another nation. I find this last sentence absolutely remarkable. Translations so that Israel shall not need another nation. So translation here is really presented as kind of a solution to that ambivalence of extra-Jewish knowledge. On one hand, it's a sure and swift means to enrich the Jewish library, to allow Jews to participate in the kind of cultural ferment that is going on in the surrounding culture. But on the other hand, it's a means to control and to moderate the infiltration of non-Jewish texts and ideas into Jewish culture. Now, we tend often to think of translation as a bridge, right? There's this humanistic kind of notion that translation is a bridge between cultures. But here, I think it really emerges not so much as a bridge, but as a floodgate, as a means to kind of moderate the flow of non-Jewish ideas into the Jewish community. And again, to prevent both at one and the same time, cultural isolation and cultural assimilation. Okay, so we have kind of an idea now about who translated and why they translated. And the last point that I'd like to dwell on is the question of how they translated. And I'm going to be focusing on what I understand to be two particular oddities of the corpus of Jewish translation in this period. That is, on the one hand, the production of unacknowledged translations, and on the other hand, or not so much on the other hand, but closely related, the domestication of works in translation. So I'm going to go back to this translation by Abraham ben Elijah of Vilna, the son of the Vilna Gaon. And those of you who are able to read Hebrew can see that if you look at the cover page, there is no indication that this book is a translation at all. And this is not a coincidence. If you read the entire book cover to cover, it never identifies as a translation. And in fact, it never even mentions Buffon, or for that matter, any non-Jewish thinker whatsoever. So the only references are to Jewish literature, to the thought of primarily Chazal, the ancient Jewish sages, but also other canonical Jewish works. Now, to us today, this seems like plagiarism, right? This is we would frown upon such practices, and I talk to my students constantly about how they need to cite their sources. But in the early modern period, this was hardly an exception. So what you're seeing here, this chart is actually based on a sample of 383 translations into Hebrew and Yiddish, which appeared during the early modern period between 1500 and 1775. And you'll notice that most of the translations that we have in our sample of translations are to some extent unacknowledged, meaning that we have 38% that are entirely unacknowledged, meaning that they don't present themselves as translations at all. And then another 18% are works that do present themselves as translations, but don't tell us anything about their sources. Now, taking into account the fact that it is much, much easier for us today to identify translations that do identify as translations, it stands to reason that the phenomenon is even more widespread than this figure suggests. So what's going on? Why do these translators produce translations that do not identify as such, or that today, to us today, appear to be original works? Well, I think the immediate answer that comes to mind is that they are trying to hide the fact that they are translating non-Jewish works. And this is indeed the case with some translations. Avraham ben Eliyahu of Vilna's Gvulot Aretz is one example. Another example is this book, Sefer Lekach Tov, by an Italian author by the name of Avraham Yagel. It's published in 1595. And this book actually becomes kind of a bestseller by early modern standards. It's translated into Yiddish at some point. And it is presented as a book that should be read by anyone who calls himself a Jew. But towards the end of the 19th century, two German scholars identify the work as a translation of a Christian catechism by the Jesuit scholar Petrus Canisius. So you can see here how the fact that Yagel didn't acknowledge his source and presented his work as a Jewish work, allowed the work to be received very, very smoothly by Jews. Certainly no one would have translated this work into Yiddish and presented it as, you know, a model of Jewish piety had they known that it is a translation of a Latin catechism. So certainly there were those who concealed the fact that the work was a translation knowingly, actively, but I would say that in most cases, the reasons for kind of obfuscating the source text or the fact that the work was a translation was somewhat less devious. And one indication of that is that if you look at the chart again, you'll see that most of the translations, most of the works that are translated into Yiddish do not identify as translations. So I want to focus a little more closely on Yiddish for a few moments. So one example of a translation that doesn't identify as such in Yiddish is this book, Seder Harei Olam, or Seder Harei Olam Beschreibung. This is actually a translation of the first modern subject encyclopedia, which is this, the Die Kuriose Orographia by Johann Gottfried Gregory, also known as Melissantes. The Yiddish translation comes out in 1792, and again, it doesn't identify as a translation, and it never mentions Melissantes or any other non-Jewish source throughout the book. But readers of this book would have been hard-pressed to imagine it as anything but a translation. Yiddish works in the field of science were quite rare, and where they appeared at all, they were almost always translations. But if any doubt remained as to the non-Jewish provenance of the work, its organization according to the German alphabet would have been foolproof indication of the fact that it is a translation. So you can see here that mountains, it's supposed to be organized alphabetically, but here mountains that begin with the letter Bet, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, are followed by mountains, not by mountains beginning with the letter Gimel, the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but by mountains beginning with the letter Kuf, the 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Kaf, the 11th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And this is simply because of the ABC. So no one would have read this book and thought that this is original Jewish work, or that this is the original creation of the Yiddish translator. But still, this translator took Melissantes' very verbose tome and cleaned it, and he really purged it of any mention of non-Jewish sources. Melissantes himself was an extremely erudite man of science, and he mentions Seneca and Virgil and Lucretius and numerous others, and not one of them is mentioned in the Yiddish translation. Now, I don't have kind of an, there's no ironclad explanation for this, but it does seem to me that the translator simply thought that these names would be meaningless to a Yiddish readership, and that's why they don't appear in the book's translation. And I want to give another example, which I think illustrates this in a really beautiful, very, very Yiddish way. And this is a translation not of a non-Jewish work, but of a Jewish one. In 1592, the Jewish chronicler, Prague-based author by the name of David Gans, produces a history book called Tzemach David. Now that book is wildly popular and it is translated into Yiddish in 1697. Gans's book was actually, it consisted of two parts. The first part was dedicated to Jewish history, so to speak, and the second part was dedicated to what we still unfortunately refer to as general or European history. Now, in the preface to the second part of the book, Gans was kind of, he opened with a kind of apologetic preface explaining that the second part of the book, because it doesn't deal with Jewish history, he'd had to rely on a lot of non-Jewish literature. And this is what he writes. Many will open their mouths to scorn me and will find fault in my endeavor for having translated from the works of authors who are not of the children of Israel. And he goes on to provide precedents for other authors who've done the same, Yosef Cohen, Avraham Farisol, Maimonides, and many, many, many others. The Yiddish translation of the book, however, omits this lengthy preface, and instead the publisher, a certain Zalman Hanau of Frankfurt, explains that he doesn't feel the need to go on and on about why this is a legitimate pursuit. And he explains, this is too boring for the reader who has no patience to read it. But the essence of the matter is that all that is here written has been taken from the Hebrew and German books of geography or chronicles. So this is amazing to me because this Yiddish author really takes this ancient, very complex, very heated debate about the legitimacy of the pursuit of non-Jewish knowledge and reduces it to something that is boring. Yeah, he writes, es ist zu langweil. He then goes on to berate Gans for his reliance, his excessive reference to non-Jewish sources such as Cassius oder Bastius oder Goltzius oder sonsten seltsame Namen. So Cassius or Bastius or Goltzius or other strange names. Now, to us, this sounds merely formulaic, but in fact, he is referring to three specific authors on whom Gans often relies, and these are Georg Cassius, Martin Borek, and Hubert Goltzius, who are mentioned several times in Gans's book. So for Hanau, these names were hardly selling points, but really just a way to intimidate potential Yiddish readers for whom they would have been entirely devoid of meaning. So we also have some translators who neglect to cite their sources because they view them, again, as derivative, echoes of this pristine Jewish knowledge from which they originate. One example of this is, again, Solomon of Chelm, the 18th century Polish rabbi. In the 18th century, he produces a translation which Rechav Rubin has identified as being based on the works of Christian van Adrichem and Matthäus Zeuter. Again, he doesn't mention his sources by name, but he does say that he translated some work, and this is what he writes in the preface. May the temple be built and the holy city restored. And if, God forbid, I shall not live to see it restored, may God at least permit me to behold its ruins. And I shall stand from afar and look at its site on the map. And I shall take pity on the holy cities which have been draped in foreign garments. And I shall remove their veils, and I shall recognize their visage. And I shall translate from the foreign tongue into our holy tongue. So you can see that for Solomon, translation was really a way of reclaiming lost Jewish knowledge and bringing it back to the Jewish tongue and to Jewish readers. And he does this kind of, acrobatic rhetorical maneuver by which he manages to present the source as merely kind of a copy, a pale copy of the real source, which is, in essence, Jewish. And if you think about translation in this way, through this kind of reverse translational cycle, it really explains why any mention of the source would be entirely superfluous, because the source is really just the mediating text. The real source is the Bible or Jewish wisdom. Okay, so I've also mentioned domestication, and really, regardless of why they chose to obscure their sources, the fact of the matter is that by presenting these works without acknowledging the sources, these translators were participating in a practice which is very widespread in Judaism in this period, which is the practice of domestication, taking texts from the foreign culture and making them feel more at home within Judaism or Judaizing them. I'm just going to give two very, very brief, I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll give very brief examples of how domestication works. This text is a late text, but I brought it because it's lovely, it's quite interesting. It's a translation of Robinson Crusoe into Yiddish, where the translator takes this very English a novel by Daniel Defoe and turns it into a very Yiddish book. Crusoe himself becomes an East European merchant who goes by the name of Alter Leb, and his Caribbean slave Friday becomes, in this version, a Judaized kind of servant slave who goes by the name of Shabbos. So that kind of shows you one translator who is very, very invested in domesticating his translation. But most translators will settle for just changing a word here or there. And I'm specifically thinking of Yiddish translators now. These translators will often take a text from German and simply transliterate it into Hebrew letters. I have one example here of the 1600 translation of the tale of Eulenspiegel, the famous German jest. And what you can see is that this is a very close translation. You can't really even call it a translation. It is a transliteration. But what the translator does, he takes the opportunity every time something, a term that has to do with Christianity appears, he'll just change it into a derogatory or polemical term. So in this particular instance, the term Heilig Geist, Holy Ghost, is translated as Schmaligeist, in what is actually the earliest instance of the ironic SHM reduplication, which is still used today to create such forms as fancy schmancy or history schmistery. Okay, so I just want to conclude by saying that throughout the early modern period, I think what we can see is that translation is a much more ubiquitous phenomenon than we've imagined before. And the interesting thing about it is that it takes place on all levels of society, from rabbis through publishers, printers, converts, anonymous translators. Almost everyone is translating. And when I say almost, I really mean almost all men, because as we unfortunately are all too aware, there are very few women authors in Judaism in this period. But if we look at Jewish culture in the early modern period through the prism of translation, it emerges as very, very dialogic. And this notion that we often have of there being a Jewish library or a Jewish book becomes very, very porous. And we have to look closely at these Jewish works in order to be able to understand their relationship with the surrounding culture. And I do want to mention that I don't mean to paint an all too rosy kind of picture of Jewish-Christian relations in this period. We can also see how translation is often mistranslation, how there's always apprehension about bringing these texts into Judaism. You know, on the one hand, there is this desire to participate in non-Jewish culture and to import works from non-Jewish languages. But on the other hand, there is this desire to control the influx of these works. And texts are constantly being manipulated, domesticated, mistranslated. And this kind of gives us an opportunity to look at moments of silence, hesitation, embarrassment, even resistance and restraint. And in this way, I think translations foreground the unique cultural, social, and religious repertoires of their authors, and they demonstrate both the power but also the limitations of intercultural exchange. And before I conclude, I just want to say thank you to my research team. A lot of what I've presented here is, I am indebted to them for their help. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a really amazing talk. Really delighted. We encourage people with questions to either raise their hands or put them in the chat. I think we'll start off with a question that Susan put in the chat earlier, asking about the concept of copyright. Was there a concept of copyright in the times of these translations?
Thank you. So not so much. There isn't really a concept of copyright per se. it does begin to emerge during the 17th and 18th centuries, and you will find sometimes these rabbinical approbations are actually attempts to control copyright, saying that anyone who plagiarizes this book is going to be excommunicated. But this only applies to, I think, to within the Jewish world. No one will have any qualms about taking a text that is not Jewish, translating it into a Jewish language and presenting it as his own work. Also, because it's just so much work, especially if you do it into Hebrew, it's understood to be, a huge endeavor. But one example that I always like to give is the fact that when that plagiarism really isn't so much understood as plagiarism. When the first definitions of plagiarism begin to appear in dictionaries in the 19th century and late 18th century, a lot of them are plagiarized. So that really shows you how there's still not really consolidated notion of plagiarism.
Thank you. I see Jordan Katz has a question.
Thank you so much for this. It was so interesting. And as you know, I am working on related topics. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the lecture due to another commitment, but so apologies if this is, asking something that you mentioned. I'm curious. I know that you said that there are very few translations authored by women. Have you found any? My own research has found just one commissioned by a woman. So I'm curious about that. And I'm, if you could speak a little bit more to that at all. And in addition, at least what I attended of the presentation, you were mostly talking about printed works. What about things that are translated into manuscript and perhaps prepared for print, or perhaps with an idea to prepare them for print, but that don't make it there? I mean, how does that fit into this story?
Thank you. That's great. Well, first of all, I should say the only translation that we have in the database that is, that women play any kind of role in its production is the one that you've discovered. So no, we don't have any translations by women that we know of. I mean, of course, some of these anonymous Yiddish translators could be women, but it's very unlikely. We do have, cultural translations that women participate in proliferating or creating. So in Glickel's memoirs, of course, there are cases of stories that are international kind of tales that receive this specific Jewish treatment and so on, but we don't have any women translators who participate in creating this corpus, I'm afraid. There are reasons for that, and I have an article that's coming out in the AJS review where I specifically discuss the exclusion of women, but it's a long story, so I'll just leave it at that. Manuscripts, yes, this is a fascinating question because we do have manuscripts, and you'd expect some of them are prepared for print, but we have manuscripts that are clearly meant for personal edification. No one's going to publish these. And what we find is that in these manuscripts, you'll find the same thing. Often domestication will also be prevalent in these manuscripts, which shows us that domestication isn't just, it's often presented in literature, particularly on the Haskalah, on Maskilic translations, as a way of kind of softening the blow of non-Jewish thought and trying to propagate Maskilic propaganda under a traditional Jewish guise. But if you look at manuscripts from the 17th century and the early 18th century, you'll see that they're deeply domesticated, which I think shows that for many, many Jewish translators, to translate is in essence to domesticate. You don't translate without it. They don't do it in order to appear more Jewish. They do it because it is part of the process of cultural transfer.
I see another question also by Susan, was asking if there was a substantial number of people who might have read such works in the original language that the translators were trying to shield from going off into the non-Jewish world of literature.
Yeah, I would say that it depends where. Many of the observations I'm going to make, I should always, say it depends where and it depends in which language. In Italy, certainly there is a lot of Italian literacy, as of course you, Francesca, know, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And in fact, Yiddish translation disappears in Italy in the middle of the 17th, by the mid 17th century. There's no more Yiddish in Italy per se. And in this case, so one of the things that is interesting for me to always think about is the difference between translating into a Jewish language in Italy and translating into a Jewish language in Ashkenaz. And I think there are widely different meanings. In Ashkenaz translation, there is the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews won't be able to read this literature if it's not translated. Whereas in Italy, the vast majority of Jews will be able to read, and many of them won't be able to read it in Hebrew. So it has very, very different implications in these two spaces.
We have a kind of related question from Diana asking about Yiddish literacy, who would have had access to books, but I think we could sort of pose the question even more broadly, just in terms of the social classes that you're talking about with a lot of these translations.
Yeah. So again, Yiddish literature is read by most Ashkenazim. They will be able, so this, Jordan was asking about women earlier. So obviously women read Yiddish. So if you translate something into Yiddish, you know that you're translating to a much wider audience than you are if you're translating into Hebrew. And this obviously implicates, this has influences the kinds of texts that will be translated into Yiddish and into Hebrew. So in Yiddish, we'll find much more literary works, prose, poems, things like that. Whereas in Hebrew, we will find more works of science, philosophy, religion, and so on.
As we're waiting for more questions, I have one of my own. And I wonder, since you're building this really helpful database so you can have a big picture of the situation, if you have seen patterns looking at which languages had the most translations in which decades or in which centuries, and if you see a shift also, thinking about translations into Judeo-Italian, as you were saying, or into Ladino. I'm thinking more of the Mediterranean area rather than the Ashkenazi area. And if those translations either decline or increase depending on which decade you're looking at.
Yeah, so we have, I should have brought it. Hang on, maybe I did. Let me see, I have a chart showing languages. So we do actually have different languages in different areas and different periods. No, it's not in my code, but actually there is one development over time that may be interesting in that context. So languages, obviously the primary language that Jews translate from into Hebrew in the earlier period is Latin, and that gets replaced by Italian at some point if you're looking at the Mediterranean. But if you look at Yiddish, obviously it'll be German more or less throughout the period. But if we do look at variation over time, so one of the really interesting things, I think, and this goes back to one of the questions that was asked before about the difference in literacy. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly again to show this, these two charts. Sorry. Oh. Okay, so here you can see what I've done here is I've combined our database with Mauro Zonta's list of translations in the fields of science and philosophy. And you can see this is from 1200 to 1800, and this is what's going on in Italy. So you have translators in dark blue bars and translations in light blue bars. And you can see that there's a slight kind of increase in translation in the 15th century, but there's not much change going on in Italy. And this, I think, shows what to me seems like the very conservative nature of Italian translation into Jewish languages in Italy. If you want to do something radical in Italy in this period, you don't necessarily do it in Hebrew, and certainly not in Yiddish. And if you compare this to what's going on in Ashkenaz, that's a completely different, and this really shows, I think, the very, very real difference between the meanings of translation in Ashkenaz and in Italy.
Since Francesca asked her own question, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one of my own. Working in the earlier medieval period and in the Islamic world, your talk really kind of touched on so many kind of interesting sort of parallel issues and really highlighted some of the really profound differences in the way translation takes place in the medieval Islamic world. So just, you know, one thing to point out that really stood out for me was a kind of absence of discussion of the language itself. Hebrew plays such an important role, sort of what the translation effort is accomplishing for the status of the Hebrew language, plays such an important role in the medieval Islamic world when these translations are undertaken. I noticed a little bit of it in that last slide from Solomon of Chelm, talking about the Holy Tongue. But as you pointed out, that was more sort of about kind of reclaiming Jewish knowledge. But the medium itself is so much more important, I think, for the translators in the earlier period. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Is that just a kind of cultural difference, or?
Well, I think the question of language will be very, very, of Hebrew specifically, will become increasingly important during the 18th century. When the Maskilim begin to translate for them, they make a point of translating into Hebrew. And for these translators, this is a way of kind of, you know, reviving Hebrew. And this is actually, it's part of that first justification for translation, you know, the strengthening Judaism by importing, or revitalizing Judaism by importing non-Jewish works into Hebrew. And we do find some of that in the earlier translations as well. But and in Italy, that will be one of the justifications for translation into Hebrew, because there really is very little other justification to translate into Hebrew if everyone's reading the works in Italian anyway. So there is some of that, but I wouldn't characterize it as being you know, a major consideration for these translators.
Okay, thank you.
We have a broad question by Lorraine Obler that I think you know, we can zoom out from many of the threads that you've been talking about. She's asking why the difference between Italy and Ashkenaz in terms of knowledge of the non-Jewish languages.
Why is there a difference between Italy and Ashkenaz?
Why is there? Why is it that in Italy Jews know Italian and in Ashkenaz Jews don't know the vernacular?
Wow, that's a huge question. First of all, I should say that these are different Jews. I mean, on the other hand, we do have an Ashkenazi Jewish community in Italy, but we also have Sephardi Jews, and we also have Italian Jews, so Jews who were in Italy before the expulsion of the Jews of Spain and the expulsion of many Jews in Ashkenaz. So there's a very amalgamated community. To some extent, I mean, the communities are set apart by various ritual differences, and they often go to different synagogues and so on. But when I talk about Italian Jews, I'm really talking about this entire group of Jews who are both Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and why are they more? So first of all, we should also always think about the fact that Sephardi Jews don't feature that much in my project in general, because they are often literate in non-Jewish languages. And if you try to think about what a Jewish language is for Sephardi Jews in the Netherlands, for instance, in Amsterdam, it wouldn't be Hebrew or any other language that is written in Hebrew script, but rather Portuguese. So this is a very different kind of literacy that you'll find in these communities. And also another thing to bear in mind is, as you could see in that chart that I showed earlier, there was a tradition of translation into Jewish languages in Italy that simply didn't exist in Ashkenaz, which is a much more seemingly enclosed community, the Ashkenazi one.
Thank you.
Diana has an interesting question about children's education, although Diana, I'm not entirely sure what do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to understand how this permeation, the entrance of foreign ideas, so-called, came into children's education. How early and through what structures?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of schooling? I guess I'm trying to broaden my understanding of how access to books and learning happened among the young.
Mm. Well, that's an interesting question, because we don't know much about children's education. I think, and Francesca, correct me if I'm wrong, we know very little about children's education in Italy in the early modern period, right?
There are some studies by Julia Lieberman, who's looked specifically at, I think, Sephardic manuals for children's education. And we do have I think it's a rather general sense based on, minutes or programmatic descriptions of what certain, a Talmud Torah would do. But there have not been studies, I believe, more focused on that.
Yeah, so one thing that bears mentioning is the fact that Jagel's translation of Canisius's catechism, that catechism is actually designed for young readers. And we do know that it was taught, one of the members of my team, Melanie Plever, is actually working on that translation and seeing what was done with it. And she told me that Canisius was actually taught in these Italian schools. So it'd be interesting to think about whether or not Jagel envisioned it as a book that was that targeted young readers. So I'm not sure that he did. Children's books, children's books designed specifically for children are a rather late phenomenon in general, but particularly in the Jewish literary realm. And when they do come in the late 18th century, translation plays a huge role in those books, because what the Maskilim in the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century will do is to take German children's books and translate them into Hebrew. And actually, Avraham ben Eliyahu of Vilna, his book, Gvulot Aretz, isn't based directly on Buffon, but on an adaptation of Buffon for children. But I think within the Jewish literary realm, the difference between books for children and books for adults, it's a bit vague right up until I would say even the 1830s.
The next question is also from Susan, who is asking if literacy was higher among Jews than among other groups.
I couldn't really say. It's not so much my field. I do know that usually, I think most studies would argue that it is, but I don't think we have precise numbers, and so I couldn't really say.
Let me ask another question of you. you've been talking primarily about translations from sort of outside the Jewish community, translations that facilitate the incorporation, the inclusion of outside material within the Jewish community. What about translations within the Jewish community? Right, so I mean, I think a couple of the texts you sort of talked about kind of moving from one language to another. What are the kind of the different dynamics at work when the translation is kind of moving it from one Jewish language to another?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually, I think, the next stage of this project for us. Right now, what we've been working on primarily is to try and map, because so many of these translations are unacknowledged. So the greater part of the work has actually been to map the corpus and identify the scope of the phenomenon. But now that we've pretty much come to the conclusion that everything is a translation, I think the next step for us will be to look at translations in between Jewish languages. We already know that some of these works are translated. Usually the translation will go from Hebrew to Yiddish or to Ladino. There are cases in which texts are translations into Yiddish are translated then into Hebrew, though we really have, I think, a handful of such cases. And obviously the texts do change as they move. They become a little more, they get dumbed down when they go from Hebrew to Yiddish because of, you know, the way these translators and authors think about Yiddish readership, and because this is designed a lot of the time for women. I just remembered that there was one thing that Francesca asked about Judeo-Italian. I have to say that we were surprised to find very, very few translations into Judeo-Italian. So there are many translations from Hebrew into Judeo-Italian and into Ladino, but we found very few cases of works being translated from Italian into Judeo-Italian. Most of the works that we've found are manuscripts, not published works. And Ladino has also been, it's kind of a smaller corpus than the Hebrew and Yiddish ones.
Thank you.
One more question by Susan, who is asking if we know if publications of these translations were profitable. So what's the financial consideration here?
Yeah, so to translate into Hebrew is definitely not profitable. There are very few readers who read Hebrew, and even if, I mean, the profit is not really a consideration when you translate into Hebrew. You do have these figures like Yaakov Tzalon, who says, you know, I'm translating, he publishes a book called Otzar HaChaim in 1683, and he claims that this is for everyone, and this is for people in small villages who can't afford to go to the doctor. But it's a huge book, and it must have been insanely expensive, and it's written in very, you know, heavy-handed Hebrew. But Yiddish translations do seem to have been profitable, and one indication is that the same texts are translated and retranslated over and over. Eulenspiegel, for instance, Die Sieben Waisenmeister, Die Schiene Magellone. There's like a group of works that are translated again and again, and the fact that these publishers are participating in creating these translations and commissioning these translations would indicate that they do enjoy a great deal of popularity.
Can we say anything about the material aspects of these books? Anything interesting happen when a Latin or Greek work is translated into a Jewish language in terms of the physical book?
Yeah. So one of our team members, Magdalena Janoshikova, has worked on the material aspects, and she does amazing work. And one of the things that she traces is in manuscripts, when do the translators use Latin script and when do they use Hebrew script? And what happens when a good book gets published? What happens to the Latin script, and so on and so forth? So she has a paper that is forthcoming in ISIS that deals with some of these aspects. And so I warmly recommend that work by Magdalena.
Do we know if there is a phenomenon where, if the translation is not acknowledged and it sort of enters the mainstream, Jewish authors will later appropriate it, and it will simply meld into a broader sort of Jewish consciousness? I'm asking because from time to time, I receive some strange questions from students, such as that think, for instance, that Aristotle was Jewish. I'm not sure where that comes from, right? But there's an understanding that certain certain branches of knowledge should be Jewish, and I wonder if the process of translation has anything to do with that sort of deeper belief that we find sometimes in Orthodox communities.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to think about it. I think when you look at one genre of translation that I haven't discussed is apocryphal literature that is translated, and there you really see this notion that these are texts that should have been ours from the get-go, and they are deeply Jewish, and because they were originally written in Hebrew, the Hebrew kind of manages to reach us through the cracks of the languages. Naftali Hertzbeiser has a beautiful preface where he talks about the light of Hebrew shining through the layers of false tongues of the Gentiles and so on. So there's that, but it's an interesting question. I have to give it some thought.
This is a totally unfair question, so it's fine if you just dodge it. But I'm wondering what's going on in Judeo-Arabic. Can you say anything about what's going on in terms of this kind of literature, this kind of phenomenon in the early modern period, in North Africa?
Well, I have to say, I am going to dodge that question, but I just want to say that I'm embarrassed to say that up until very recently, I thought there was nothing going on in Judeo-Arabic in the early modern period. I thought that was kind of a phenomenon of the medieval period. But I recently encountered a scholar by the name of Rachel, I think her name is Rachel Chasson Kant, who works on translation into Judeo-Arabic in the early modern period. So I'm looking forward, she just wrote a dissertation on that topic. So I'm looking forward to seeing what she has to say about it.
Okay, great. Francesca,
I think, yeah, it looks like we have no more questions, and we're nearing the end of our time here. So yeah, please join me in thanking Dr. Idelson-Shein for such a stimulating and rich presentation. This was truly wonderful. And Arnold, do you want to announce? We can announce the next meetings of both our centers.
Yes, I just want to echo Francesca's sentiment. This was really wonderful. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Iris, for a really fantastic talk. The Queen's College Center for Jewish Studies next and final event will be on April 27th. Jonathan Greenblatt is coming to Queen's College for a conversation with Queen's College President Frank Wu about his new book, Jonathan Greenblatt's new book, It Could Happen Here. That will be both in person and live streamed. And I'll put the website for anyone who's interested in the chat.
And I want to announce the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center's last event for the semester, which is taking place on May 6th. And it's going to be a conversation with Nomi Stolzenberg and David Myers, who are going to present their latest book, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. And this is going to be at 12 p.m. Because they're joining in from California. So Friday, May 6th at 12 p.m.
Super.
thank you again so much. Thank you so much, Iris.
Thank you.
This was truly fantastic. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more and reading more from you and from your team.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.